Good morning, it's Air Talk. I'm Lauren Atzel. Wonderful to have you with us. You just heard NPR talking about the plan President Biden has for immigration and citizenship. Democrats in Congress introducing that bill today, and we'll be talking about that later this hour. But first, we turn our attention to the Los Angeles County District Attorney's Office, where this massive prosecutorial agency is undergoing huge changes under reformist DA George Gascón. He was San Francisco's district attorney. He was prior to that here in Los Angeles, a high-ranking official with the LAPD. But since leaving the policing side of it to become a district attorney, Gascón has positioned himself as a reformer, and he has touted the idea of having many people released early from prison, attempting to lower the numbers of people of color relative to whites who are incarcerated here in California and within LA County's jurisdiction. He was on with us just 3 weeks ago talking about a number of issues, and we asked him about the pushback that he's receiving, including from the prosecutors' union.
Look, we're moving a massive system that has been deeply embedded in mass incarceration and punishment for generations, but especially in the last 40 years. And the district attorneys that you're mentioning, these are people that have been very much part of the mass incarceration era.
One of our listeners wrote and said that the new DA's policies disrespect the rights of victims.
It's really important that we strike a balance in addressing the needs sometimes for, the desire for retribution of a victim today, but also that we balance that with the needs of our community and the capacity to deal with victimization in the future. Recidivism implies that there are many victims in the future that get harmed because of bad policies today, number one. Number two, one of the things that we are doing, and we're starting in this path, is that we're creating a different way of approaching our victim services through science and trauma-informed care.
That's District Attorney George Gascón, who was recently with us on Air Talk. Now, the Association of District Attorneys for LA County, the deputy DAs, filed a lawsuit against the district attorney, saying that he is not going to use enhancements in the majority of cases for sentencing. The 3 strikes would not be enforced during his tenure. A judge, though, LA Superior Court Judge James Chalfant, ruled last week for a preliminary injunction that blocks a number of those changes the district attorney wants to use, including the 3 strike allegations and some of the sentencing enhancements that he wants to set aside. With us to talk about that decision and the discord within the DA's office is the president of the Association of Deputy District Attorneys for LA County, Michele Hanisee. Ms. Hanisee, thank you for being with us again on Air Talk.
Thank you so much for inviting me.
So you got this positive court decision. It is just a temporary block, but what sorts of changes are going to be allowed under this? Because it was not a thoroughgoing rebuke of what the DA is attempting to do.
No, nor did the lawsuit address all of the policies. It addressed a very select few policies that are unique in that the policies direct the prosecutors in the office to violate the law and violate their ethical obligations in their oath of office. So it was a very directed lawsuit. It doesn't touch the vast majority of his policies. It really applies to those laws which are required to be charged and are mandatory.
The district attorney was very clear in our conversation that he thinks the sentencing enhancements and use of 3 strike provisions contribute to what he calls mass incarceration and to the racial disparities that we see in prison populations. So with that in mind, why do you think the reforms shouldn't be enacted if they would help to bring about more racial parity in sentencing and incarceration?
Well, let me begin by saying there's no suggestion by our lawsuit that there should be any racial disparity. Everyone's against racial disparity. So the very manner in which you ask the question presumes that, and I have to disagree with that point. But the key thing here is, although Mr. Gascón was elected by the voters, no elected official is empowered to violate the law or to order government employees to violate the law. He has an affirmative duty to carry out the laws enacted by the voters in the legislature. So this is a classic separation of powers issue. I've said this many times. The legislature alone and the voters are authorized to enact laws. The judiciary is the only part of government authorized to rule on the legality of those laws. And the executive, that is the elected official, has to follow the law. And Mr. Gascón and his directives acknowledges that his policies are contrary to the law, but he justifies them by saying he believes they're bad policy. Well, that is a violation of the separation of powers, and it's a violation of his duties as an executive to follow the law. It's that simple.
The district attorney, though, says the office has never filed every strike in 3 strikes cases, that there has been discretion by the district attorney's office, and that the law is not just followed precisely on every point. So if that's the case and there has been a historic degree of discretion, what's the matter with him saying we're just not going to prosecute strikes?
Well, it's not the case, and he misrepresents the history of this office when he says that. That is not the case. Under present law and under policy prior to him, the policy of the office was to file all strikes, so long as they were appropriate and provable. You know, you have to have proof of the prior. If you can't get proof, obviously, you shouldn't charge anything, any crime. But we were required under prior policy to file all strikes. The one time there was a deviation from the strikes law was under the tenure of District Attorney Steve Cooley, and that was prior to the change in the strike law that he initiated to avoid those circumstances where someone was getting sentenced to 25 to life for a petty theft. And the law changed to follow Mr. Cooley's policies. But the difference in the way Mr. Cooley did it was he did a case-by-case analysis based on the facts of the individual case. It was not a blanket policy. The current district attorney's policy is a blanket policy without any consideration of individualized facts.
Again, back to the racial argument that George Gascón is making is that regardless of the intent of the sentencing enhancements and the stated intent of creating more public safety, that they have had an unintended consequence of creating these huge racial disparities. So if not failing to prosecute with these enhancements, what other way would you attempt to reduce the disparity?
This, if he believes that there is a genuine racial disparity based upon the structure of the law, the avenues he has are to petition the legislature to change the law. And we do have a robust legislative branch in our office. We have deputy district attorneys who live in Sacramento for the sole purpose of lobbying for legislation, and he can do it that way. He can also challenge those laws in the courts. So he has avenues to challenge laws if he thinks that they're in any way disparate or inappropriate.
We're talking with Michele Hanisee. She is the president of the Association of Deputy District Attorneys for Los Angeles County. We're talking about District Attorney George Gascón and the preliminary decision that the judge handed down last week that says that the district attorney's refusal to prosecute certain sentencing enhancements and the 3 strikes law on a consistent basis is not legal for the DA to do that. So let's talk as well about it's another issue where the district attorney has expressed concerns about racial representation. He resigned this week from the California DA's Association, saying it has an all-white board of directors, saying it's only interested in promoting tough on crime policies. This, of course, follows efforts of the DAs in Sacramento, San Diego, and in Orange County to try and get back jurisdiction of cases where the DA's office Angeles under Gascón is not pursuing more stringent sentencing. What do you think the effect will be of your boss leaving that organization?
Well, my understanding from their response was he wasn't a member to begin with, so I suspect it'll have zero effect on that organization.
What about his critique that this is an organization that exists to support tough on crime policies, not to try and address the racial disparities in the criminal justice system?
Well, if he's not a member, how would he know what they're doing and what their policies are? And ironically, he unseated a Black female Democrat district attorney who is in line to be the next president of that organization. She now cannot be the next president because she's not an elected DA. So if anyone's standing in the way of diversity in the California District Attorneys Association, it was Mr. Gascón by defeating Ms. Lacey in the election.
We're talking with Michele Hanisee of the Association of Deputy District Attorneys of Los Angeles. Of course, that election was not much about race of the candidates, about what the policies of the candidates would be on racial disparities in the criminal justice system. And do you think that there will be a difference in that under your new boss as opposed to your previous one?
Are you asking if I think there will be a difference in the degree of racial disparity in the criminal justice system?
Yes.
That's an impossible question to answer. That's asking me to predict the future, which I am.
Well, I guess what I'm asking is, do you think his policies will achieve what he's hoping that they will achieve?
Not necessarily. Some of them may and some of them may not. The real problem with his policies are most of his policies grant leniency and reduce sentences to violent offenders, not to nonviolent offenders. They let violent offenders out early, and there is no science and data that supports his premise that releasing violent offenders early without providing adequate rehabilitation will result in increased public safety. And the problem is he's put the cart before the horse. He's releasing violent offenders early without first putting in place effective rehabilitation. Without effective rehabilitation, you're going to have recidivism, and that means more victims of crime. And I know he likes to say that that's fear-mongering, but is it fear-mongering to quote actual statistics, saying the murder rate is up nearly 30% in Los Angeles and is at a 10-year high, and that violent crime rates are going up? Because those are facts.
One of the points that he makes is research shows that keeping people in prison for more than 20 years has no benefit on public safety, that sentences longer than that serve no public purpose. Your response to that claim?
Well, okay, firstly, that study, and that's the Texas study, doesn't address sentences of 20 years and more at all. The Texas study that he cites consistently found that putting nonviolent offenders, and in this particular study, it was limited to drug users convicted of drug use offenses, putting those individuals in a custodial setting increased the chances of recidivism. However, in California, we're not incarcerating drug users at all, and they're not being sent to prison for nonviolent offenses. Mr. Gascón's policies don't affect the drug users of the world who may get in trouble with the law as a result of that drug use. His policies target violent offenders, and violent offenders are serving longer sentences because their offenses are violent, not through necessarily some effect of their going to prison. So that Texas study just doesn't say what he represents it says.
We're talking with Michele Hanisee, the president of the Association of Deputy District Attorneys of Los Angeles County. They prevailed in court, getting a temporary injunction against the policy changes that District Attorney George Gascón had implemented immediately after being instated in that office after winning the November election. His changes that he brought in included not seeking many different sentencing enhancements, as well as not prosecuting according to additional strikes under the three strikes law. Ms. Hanisee, let's talk as well about the announcement from the district attorney he's going to hire former federal prosecutor Lawrence Middleton to prosecute police officers involved in shooting. He was part of the team, Middleton was, that prosecuted the officers who beat Rodney King. And the DA has also signaled he wants to prosecute officers in at least 4 old shootings dating back as far as 2013. What do you think of the DA's move?
Well, it's an interesting proposal to hire an outsider to come in and prosecute these cases. And I don't know if he's really collaborated with the prosecutors that exist in our office that are in a special unit that exists solely to prosecute police officers and what conversations he's had with them. Bringing in Mr. Middleton might help effectuate what the district attorney is trying to accomplish. There's another possible issue with that, though, in that in Los Angeles County, all the county employees are civil service, and there are civil service rules about that. So I don't know how that's going to go over with the Civil Service Commission and Board of Supervisors. But I understand Mr. Middleton has the kind of reputation that I think would, in Mr. Gascón's opinion, be helpful to his attempts to prosecute police officers.
The increase that we've seen in violent crime, which you just talked about, the 30% increase, has largely been attributed by police chiefs like Michael Moore in Los Angeles to the pandemic and the dramatic changes that are going on with people's lives, much of this driven by gang activity. Do you concur with that, or are you seeing something different going on?
Well, in the absence of a study, it's hard to say. I'm really reluctant ever to draw causal relationships without data to support them. But I question the concept that a pandemic is causing people to commit violent crime. I understand the pandemic is affecting the economy drastically and people are out of work. And I could see how that might affect things like petty thefts to obtain food or money, resources just to stay alive. But I can't see how the pandemic is causing an increase in violent crime. Can you?
Well, I don't know. Part of it might be that people's emotions are running higher. There's a lot of pent-up anxiety, people living locked down, that could have emotional and psychological effects on people, leading them to act out violently. But you say I'm not aware of a study of that. That's just theoretical.
Well, you know, the public's not aware of one dynamic because they just don't see it. But when the law changes in a way that benefits the offenders, the criminals on the street and the criminals in prison know it. They learn it very, very, very quickly. We're already seeing videos from people incarcerated in prison who are on social media, on the phones they're not supposed to have in prison, talking about getting their Gascón direct to get out of here. And I know there was another incident of an inmate saying he was going to assault a prison guard in order to get transferred to Los Angeles so that he could get a reduced sentence under Mr. Gascón's policies. I believe that came out in the news already.
So you think that the policies he's announced have already had an effect to motivate people to commit crimes?
Well, that's what it appeared from these anecdotal incidents. And those anecdotal incidents are provable. They're on video. The inmates themselves are speaking on camera or on the phone and in recordings. So we know that the word has reached those individuals who have prior convictions that these policies will be more lenient and that they can benefit from that, and they're acting accordingly.
Yeah, well, and of course the question is, are they really going to follow through in those cases where people have made that claim? But we'll continue our conversation with Michele Hanisee. She's the president of the Association of Deputy District Attorneys of Los Angeles County. We spoke with the new DA, George Gascón, just 2-3 weeks ago, and we're hearing from the district attorney's perspective, at least the union that represents them. We'll be back in 1 minute. Coming up later this hour, we'll talk about Democrats introducing a measure in Congress that embodies the changes in immigration law and citizenship that President Biden wants to see. We'll hear about the two different paths to citizenship that he's proposing. The bill's expected to receive stiff opposition from Senate Republicans, but we'll talk about what the president is at least going for in this measure. We're just concluding our conversation with Michele Hanisee, president of the Association of Deputy District Attorneys for Los Angeles County. So before I let you go, I want to ask you, given the huge differences philosophically between your union and District Attorney Gascón, is there any place here for a meeting of minds, for compromise, or do you anticipate throughout the rest of his term this is going to be a series of legal challenges from your organization and efforts to block the changes he wants to make?
My association is very collaborative. We've reached out to Mr. Gascón. We're already working with his administration on other workplace issues. We have a very cordial relationship with his representatives, and we would be very happy to talk about these policies. More important, though, than him talking about the policies with this association is that he collaborate with the numerous subject matter experts that exist already in our office.
All right. Thank you very much, Ms. Hanisee. We appreciate your being with us today.
My pleasure.
Michele Hanisee is the president of the Association of Deputy District Attorneys of Los Angeles County. Joining me now is KPCC criminal justice reporter Frank Stoltze. Frank, you had a chance to listen to the interview, and just as we did with DA Gascón, I'm interested in your impressions about what the union leader said.
Larry, I think it was interesting that she repeated this anecdote that was reported on Fox News, and not just local Fox News, but national Fox News, that a state prison inmate recorded this video saying he was going to commit a new crime to somehow then be prosecuted under Gascón's new policies to then somehow get released early. Two things to say about that. First of all, as you know, prison inmates say a lot of things. Journalists say a lot of things. It's one anecdote. It's inflammatory, and it represents the heat around Gascón's new policies. I will say, I talked to a longtime defense attorney in LA who has represented a lot of gang members over the course of his nearly 40 years in LA. And he said they already know about the end of the use of gang enhancements. So I'm not discounting that what she says isn't entirely untrue. That it is true that people who commit crimes follow this kind of stuff. After all, it's their business, right? They follow what's happening in the industry.
And a lot of inmates are real news junkies. You probably know that, Frank. But
yeah, right. And so, I just want to, say that, Gascón has generated this huge debate, which is fascinating, about the criminal justice system and how it should work. I should mention, the big win by the union, the prosecutors union that she represents, in allowing the continued use of enhancements, at least in current cases, is a big deal. There are something like 10,000 plus current cases, defendants who have gang enhancement, gun enhancements, great bodily injury enhancements that can add years to their sentence. Currently, in the system, and really the role of those enhancements, Larry, is big in plea deals. So, the judge ruled that the DA likely could, not use enhancements in the future, in future cases. So what we're really talking about here, is a big change in how the justice system works in terms of, deals between defendants and DAs.
And just to remind, for those who didn't hear the interview with George Gascón, he thought that was really ethically questionable to use the threat of using sentencing enhancements in prosecutions to try and leverage plea deals. And that's a huge philosophical difference. I didn't have time to get into that with Michele Hanisee, but it seems to me that represents a significant shift.
Oh yeah, and I talked to the vice president of the union yesterday, and he was talking about the role of enhancements and cutting deals, with people who rat out their fellow criminal in whatever a particular crime, and getting collaborators, the way he described it, so that you'll offer this, you'll drop a bunch of enhancements with the guy who's willing to testify against the others in a particular crime. Uh, and the head of the criminal defense bar in LA told me, this is the stock and trade of how the system works. Enhancements and plea deals. And so, one of the concerns going forward is if you're no longer going to use them, will defendants be less likely to take deals? In other words, if it's a robbery that the typical range is 2, 3, or 5 years. With a gun enhancement, let's say the guy uses a gun, it's an extra 10 years. So if you don't have those extra 10 years to play with, and yet you want to offer the guy the maximum 5 years, there's no motivation for him to take the 5-year deal because it's the maximum anyway. So he'll try to take it to trial. So there's some concern that there'll be a lot more trials.
All right. Frank, just anything else to add before I let you go?
Gascón's going to continue to make news.
Yeah, I think that's safe to say.
I think you asked about the prosecution of police officers. I mean, we're not even there yet, and that's going to be a big deal.
Yeah.
And I mentioned, you mentioned the 3 strikes. We'll talk about that next time, but that's a little bit of a separate issue. And I think there's a real debate about, how DAs should handle the 3 strikes law and whether they have to file strikes.
Well, and I also wonder if this is something that might be revisited by the legislature or in a ballot measure with 3 strikes. Has it lost popularity? Is it something that voters might vote to pare back or eliminate?
Yeah, that's a fascinating question. Gascón's going to appeal it. So, and people tell me it'll be an interesting and sort of novel case that likely will go to the state Supreme Court, whether DAs must file strikes.
Well, and of course, Los Angeles County is at the center of this debate over criminal justice reform, with the reformist district attorney George Gascón elected last November. Frank, thanks so much. We appreciate it. Have a good day.
Thanks, Larry.
Frank Stoltze, criminal justice correspondent for KPCC.